Hi, AP Psych. So we're going to move on to notebook page 9. We're going to talk about perception. Just a warning, I'm kind of playing with fire here. Jack is going to wake up from his nap, I think, soon. So he'll either wake up any minute or like another hour. The kid's unpredictable. So I apologize in advance if I abruptly stop and you hear a screaming child. All right, so we're going to talk about perception. Okay. So signal reception. How do we recognize and differentiate between the variations of sounds and what amount is required for us to detect it in the first place? So Gustav Fechner, developed the concept of absolute threshold. And I think you do need, you should have a good understanding of this for the exam. So it's the minimum stimulation needed to detect a stimulus 50% or more of the time. So light's absolute threshold is 5 light photons. Without at least 5 photons of light, the person will likely not be able to detect the presence of light. So then you also have the difference threshold, is our ability to detect the difference in signals. The threshold itself, like the absolute threshold, is one we can recognize about 50% or more accuracy. So the ability to identify a friend's voice among many in the hallway. And then we also innately possess signal detection, so the ability to detect the presence of a weak stimulus amid an extensive amount of other stimulus. So the signal detection is for there is no single threshold for signal detection. Rather, signal detection is dependent on experience, expectations, motivations, and alertness. So the example is if a parent, like let's say I'm at a party or I'm in a crowded place and I hear a baby, I'm probably going to hear the baby crying before you do. And then the next step I'm going to take is I'll be able to then figure out if that's my son crying or someone else. So the basic concept here of the signal reception is there's the absolute threshold. So there's a minimum amount of light and sound that needs to happen before you even notice it most of the time. And I like the idea of 50% plus of the time because maybe you're not paying attention or you're not feeling well or you're distracted. And then the difference threshold is the ability to differentiate between the different signals with a certain amount of accuracy. And then signal detection is based on you. So we have the absolute, so that's the minimum amount of sound or light, etc., that has to be there for you to detect it. The difference threshold, that's your ability to differentiate between different sounds. And then signal detection has to do with you. So another example could be a fireman or firefighter, right, may hear the sirens before I do because that's part of their daily life. All right, we're going to continue with signal reception. So in addition to noting the differences, we can receive and interpret information that affects our thoughts and your feelings that you're not even aware of. This is absolutely fascinating if you want to do more Google searching or looking into this. So subliminal messaging is the impact of the stimuli on our cognition and judgment that is too quick or weak to consciously interpret or to process. So basically you're being shown an image, but it's so quick that you don't see it, but you perceive it. So here's an example. The puppy werewolf experiment. So similar images of people's faces were shown to participants along with images of puppy or a fierce werewolf spliced in. So you're going to see face, 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 puppy, face, 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 werewolf, like something like that, right? So you're going to see faces with faces and faces and then puppy and then faces and faces and werewolf, right? Puppies connote happy, werewolf connotes scary. Okay, so despite the puppy and werewolf images being too quick to consciously recognize, people still constantly rated those with the puppy spliced images to be happier and nicer. So meaning the faces where the puppy images were sliced in there really quick and you couldn't even realize you saw it, you thought those people seemed really nice. Those folks are great. And then the folks where their face was spliced in with a werewolf, they're like, oh, those people seem mean. That's subliminal messaging. So despite being too quick to detect, our unconscious network still senses and perceives data, which impacts intuition and judgment. And subliminal messaging, it can be used by the government. Kind of just kidding. Please read 1984 for our own good. But it's used in marketing and things like that. So this is, I don't know how much is going to be on the test. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but this is fascinating to look at subliminal messaging. All right, cognition, think brain, right? Cognition. So interpreting sensory information. As stimuli are received, we interpret the information through two different processes, the bottom up and top down. These are two phrases I see on tests a lot, so please try to kind of understand this, or not kind of, try to understand this. All right, bottom up processing starts at sensory receptors and works to higher levels of processing. It's basically seeing something but not having any understanding of what it is. So here's the example for bottom up. You see a pile of lumber, like wood, right? As someone who doesn't understand woodworking, they could only look at the shape, the color, the textures, etc. of the wood to attempt to understand the data alone. You have no background, you have no knowledge, you're just trying to see it. So there is a picture on your page here of lumber. I see colors, I see shapes, I see corners. I couldn't tell you the type of wood that is, what it could possibly be used for. So bottom up processing. I don't have any background information about lumber, so all I could see is literally what I'm looking at. Then you have top down processing. This constructs perceptions that draw from your own experiences and your expectations, not just the object and the stimulation. So top-down processing would be seeing lumber as someone who is familiar with woodworking. They see the type, the size of the wood. They think about what they could start building with it. Could they build a house? Could they build a fence? They know the background of the wood. They know how to manipulate it, okay? So the idea is bottom-up processing is when you look at something that is unfamiliar to you and you try to familiarize it yourself with it with things that you know. You know color, you know shapes, you know sizes, you know texture. Top-down processing is when you see something you are familiar with and you could process it at a deeper level. So another example, if you are an electrician in our school and you walk into the EI shop, you're seeing tools that you know what they are and you start automatically knowing top-down processing, how to use that tool, what to do with it, how to manipulate it. Me, I don't know anything. So I look at the bottom, I'm coming from a bottom up processing. I'm seeing colors, I'm seeing shapes. Maybe I know it's a pipe, but I don't know what it's for. So that's the big difference here. Bottom up processing, you look at something, you don't really know what it is, you use what you do know to try to figure it out. Top processing, you see something, you know what it is, and you start to think about what it is, what you could do with it, how you can manipulate it, etc. All right, attention. I hope I have it. Just kidding. Well, I do. Regarding attention to stimuli, humans experience a phenomenon known as selective attention, the conscious focus on one stimulus among many. So, one example of the selective attention is listening and responding to a friend in the noise and clutter of a party. This is literally called the cocktail party effect. So, when you're in the cafeteria, when we finally get back to being real people in real world, right, we can interact with each other, and you're sitting in the cafeteria that's very, very loud, your ability to hear your friend talking over that loudness is the cocktail party effect. Regarding attention, you may fail to consciously perceive some of the information coming in through our senses, or you begin blocking things out. So here are some examples of how you lose attention. So inattentional blindness, not noticing stimuli when focused on others. So if, hold on. All right. So I show you this image and then I say, okay, how many benches did you see? And you're like, benches? That's because your eye might be focusing on the center with the falcon. You might be looking at the 50-yard line. You might be trying to check out the different circles of colors. So that inattentional blindness is not known as stimuli, because you're focusing on something else. All right, then you have change blindness, failing to notice changes in the environment, especially when selective attention focuses on our conscious thought on a single stimuli. So let's say the school over the break paints the walls a slightly different color. You may not notice that. Actually, you would notice it because you're now away from school so often. But let's say we go back. I don't know when we're going back. Did you all hear about the mayor and the governor? Nobody knows what they're talking. Anyways, let's say we go back in September, just for argument's sake. You walk into the building, you start going through school, September, October, November, and then the first week in December, they paint the walls a slightly different color. you might not notice it because you have change blindness. I actually have an example from a classroom I was in. My period 7 class might remember this. Sorry, period 2, you're in a different classroom. But I usually, I stand in the front of the class and I conduct the lesson and then I walk around and talk to kids. So I was in the back of the room while a video was on and I looked up above the smart board and I noticed like all these posters. So I'm like, wow, look at all those posters. I wonder when they got there. So I turned to a student that was also in the back of the room. And I said, when were those posters put up? And she said, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago. And I was like, Woof, 3 weeks? Because I don't know. I walk in that room every single day, but for whatever reason, because I don't look up above the smartboard, I didn't notice that all these new posters were there. So that's the change blindness. If you're used to something and there's a change, you might not notice it. And then we have sensory adaptation. So diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So if your room is stanky, you may not know because you are the only one in it, right? I know folks that are smokers, they have no idea their house smells like an ashtray because they're the ones in it. That sensory adaptation, you just get used to that odor. If you have a pet, your house may be stinkies. You don't realize it because that's your house. You get adapted to it. So sensory adaptation. You don't notice some of these things because you have constant stimulation to it. All right, perception. So regarding our perception of stimuli, we humans, I love when we say that, we humans, have a predisposition for seeing continuity and interpreting things as a whole. We've talked about this a few times, but this cognitive perceptual lens is referred to as the Gestalt principle. It's the formation of a whole, meaningful, or continuous stimuli when given things that are mixed or unintegrated. Your brain just wants to make sense of what you're looking at. So they start to put those pieces together for you. So here are some examples of the Gestalt principle perception. So figure foreground, the organization of visual fields into objects that stands out from their surroundings. So if you're looking at that image to your right hand side, you're either seeing a vase or two faces. And what's very interesting is you're only seeing that one at a time. It's pretty much impossible for you to see the vase and the faces at the same time. Now that you might have seen a vase when it opens up, and now that I'm saying faces, your brain can kind of turn on faces, turn on vase, but you can't see them at the same time, which is fascinating. So that's the figure foreground. And then you have grouping, the perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into coherent groups based on continuity, proximity, and closure. So if you were to draw three individual lines, putting them close together, your brain would see them as one single line or object, despite spaces in between. You can do a little experiment at home on that if you'd like. All right, here's another example of that idea of perception. You're either seeing a bunny rabbit or a ducky. So I'll give you a second. So the bunny rabbit, so the eye is the same for both, which is mildly creepy. And then the extension on the left-hand side is either ears or a beak. Okay, so finally, a wrap up perception. Um, Here are some figures that you may want to remember. So Gustav Fechner and Ernest Weber, absolute threshold experiments with light, photons, and waves, and sound waves. And then David Hubble and Torsten Wiesel, they feature receptors in visual cortex research and motion detection. All right, so that was perception. Please let me know if you have any questions on anything, but I hope that tutorial was informative and helpful.